Welcome back to My Seminary Life. I'm your host, Brandon Knight, and today I will be reviewing The Most Reluctant Convert, the untold C.S. Lewis story. A story that is so untold, C.S. Lewis himself wrote a whole book about it. But I promise that'll be my only snide comment in what is otherwise a very enjoyable movie. Yeah, we're keeping the C.S. Lewis train a-rolling this week, piggybacking off a little bit of last week's episode where I was talking about the conversion, specifically this conversion moment in the life of C.S. Lewis where he left Oxford to go with his brother Warney to the zoo, and when he left Oxford, he did not believe in Jesus, and after having a pretty just chilled ride over to the zoo, he believed in Jesus. That is his great conversion story, and it talks a lot about that and my sermon series I've been doing on faith and looking at, what does it mean to believe? And kind of this simplicity of true faith in Jesus. Carrying on from that, I wanted to look at this film. This is otherwise, like I said, a really enjoyable film other than this kind of like weird subtitle that this is the untold story of C.S. Lewis. The Fellowship of Performing Arts is a stage play production company. They have 3 C.S. Lewis related stage plays. One of them is this, The Most Reluctant Convert. They also have one for The Great Divorce, and the one that seems to be what I see the most about of news, and the one that seems to be touring the most, Screwtape Letters. They have a stage production of Screwtape Letters as well. And as you can guess from the titles of 2 of those, Screwtape Letters and The Great Divorce, you can determine that those are directly influenced by the book of the same title. For The Most Reluctant Convert, this stage play / now film that they have made is based primarily on Surprised by Joy. And I think it's appropriate as when you actually get into the movie itself that instead of calling it Surprised by Joy, they went with The Most Reluctant Convert as the title for the film and stage play, because it does really focus more on C.S. Lewis's various shifting philosophical and religious views, which is a part of Surprised by Joy. But I would say that Surprised by Joy focuses a little bit more on Lewis's pursuit of joy, recapturing that feeling of joy he had when his brother first brought a biscuit tin that he had decorated to look like a fairy garden with all these little, twigs and rocks and stuff, and that feeling that Lewis got first looking at it and chasing after wanting to recover that sensation again. That does come up in the movie and presumably the stage play. I have not seen the stage play version of this, but I'm assuming it comes up there as well. That is a part of the movie, but really this movie focuses more on the Lewis going from where he started at religiously to following Jesus. And to say that Lewis went from atheist to Christian is a bit simplistic. I mean, even in last week's episode, I at least threw in the agnostic part of the journey, which he actually would say theism, but is really when you get into the arc of C.S. Lewis's life, he makes a lot of, like I said, philosophical and even religious changes throughout the way. Because, like any good Irishman, he was born and raised in Catholicism, and after the death of his mother from cancer and his bargaining with God in prayer and his dad just having difficulty processing losing his wife and then in a way subsequently losing his sons because they were sent away to like a boarding school, and Lewis just being in this like Catholic school environment that just was very it just rubbed him the wrong way. It's the simplest way to put it. With all of those compounded on top of each other, Lewis goes from childhood Catholicism to atheist by the time he is a teenager. And when he enters a tutorship with an older professor, he shifts away from this, like a strictly atheist, kind of the way that like we think of with like the new atheist movement, to more of like a secular humanist. He was a materialist. A materialist, which is not being a material girl in a material world, but has a lot to do with like matter and atoms and their interaction with each other in the physical world determines how you perceive reality. That's an oversimplification of that philosophical viewpoint, but that's kind of how he enters into college, except for this one little weird blip that I think often gets overlooked in the life of C.S. Lewis, is that kind of right around the time he's entering Oxford for the first time as a student and then enters the trenches of World War I, right around that time, Lewis kind of gets sucked into the occult. He gets really into studying the occult and paganism and things like that. And C.S. Lewis, the occultist, I think often gets overlooked in the conversation of C.S. Lewis and his life. And essentially what quite literally scared him straight out of occultism is that after his service in World War I, he spent time with a fellow soldier who was very much in occultism and was going insane from like his military service and died like briefly afterwards. And C.S. Lewis was like very close to the guy, was like taking care of the guy during this stage of madness. Very, very like real life Lovecraftian kind of horror moment there. And post that, he now reverts back to like a very hard atheist materialism kind of viewpoint as he re-enters Oxford, this time as a scholar, earns a fellowship. Then he starts meeting all of his friends, Tolkien, and the other guys in the Inklings, and they're all beginning to challenge him on his materialism aspect, which eventually he then darts into theism, kind of this acceptance that there is a God, that God does exist. He is very clear that during that time period, he did not refer to God as God, but as spirit. And I forgot what the reasoning was, but there was some kind of basically trying to hold on to his dignity of having defended materialism for so long, that he still wanted to keep God away as like an impersonal thing versus like this close, intimate relationship that we have in Christianity. And well, then you get to last week's episode where I talked about of his final conversion into Christianity proper, believing in Jesus. So this is really well chronicled throughout the film. The movie's really good. Other than this, like I said, the like byline of this movie, it is a really, or byline, the subtitle of the film. It is a really good movie. It actually starts with the man who is playing C.S. Lewis in his trailer, kind of going over the script one more time, sipping on a cup of coffee, and then being escorted to the sound stage to begin the film. Marker, action. And then the film begins, like the narrative aspect of the film begins. And then the final scene of the movie is old man C.S. Lewis walking out of the chapel at Oxford. And when he steps outside, the director is there. He goes, "All right, that's a wrap. Good work, everybody." So it's this fun little the whole production is this fun little like fourth wall break style film, because the movie is old man C.S. Lewis telling you, the viewer, his life story. I thought going into this that it was going to be like a standard biopic film of here's C.S. Lewis as, a child into teen, into military, into Oxford, into Christianity. Like, I thought it was just going to be kind of that standard film, but it's old man C.S. Lewis walking you through his life story. And there's just from the stage play, knowing that this is a stage play, that kind of makes sense. It was a little bit more like, okay, I could see this working really well as a stage production. And along with just the kind of general tone of it being a fourth wall break of old man Lewis narrating this, telling you his life story, there's this other like fun moments that kind of bring you back into this like moment of you are journeying with Lewis through his story, which if there was a way that C.S. Lewis would have wanted his life story to be told, something about that seems that meta-ness seems like something he would really like. But, there's these scenes where instead of just telling you like, oh yes, I was, studying, I was with Tolkien having this conversation when he challenged me on this, it would be him walking into a room and going, oh yeah, this is the moment where this conversation happens. And then it goes to the conversation. Or really early on, one of my favorite bits in the opening sequence is him just kind of walking through Oxford and the streets of England and just kind of talking about like early on why he would not believe in God. Just kind of like walking through, like, when you look at the world and you would have asked me, is there a God? I would have pointed out to all these things as a proof that God does not exist. And at one point, as he's like walking through the town, he goes into a pub and the guy behind the bartender goes, hey, Jack, you want your usual? And he goes, yes. And then he looks at you, the person watching the film, and goes, would you like one as well? Make it 2. Why don't you go find a table while I stand here and get the beers? And so then it's like you walking over to a table, you sit down, and like a moment later, C.S. Lewis comes over and slides a beer to you. Like, obviously, I am in heaven at this moment of having a fake beer with fake C.S. Lewis. Like, this is awesome. It's a good movie. I've liked it a lot. It's worth going out of your way to kind of to check it out. I have it on DVD, so I can't really help you. I didn't check ahead of time. If it's like any other Christian film, though, that means it's probably available on all the free streaming apps. Free plug for them. I was on Tubi the other night just scrolling, looking for something to watch, and they literally had a category that was just Christian end time films, and it was all the different Left Behinds, Omega Co, just A Thief in the Night, just like all of them in one spot. It was like, wow, who uses Tubi? Like, I do, but like, who are you trying to reach, Tubi? Are you really trying to reach that category? That is so accommodating of you, seeing how all these other like very specific categories that you have on your platform to also have this category. That's quite interesting. But I did enjoy this film. There's something about, and this comes as no surprise if you've been listening to the show for a while, but there is something about that 1930s, 1940s, even a little bit before 1930 even now, there's something about that era of theology and philosophy that, like, when I look at a movie like this, when I watch a movie like this, or I read Lewis and Bonhoeffer, and I just like, these were my people. These were my guys. These guys who like were a part of the institution for sure. Lewis was a Oxford professor after all. Bonhoeffer taught at, the University of Berlin, like, or you go even further back with other people as well, whether it's Schlamacher, Adolf von Hornack, Karl Barth, like all these guys, like Tolkien, like all these guys that like more and more I'm finding a voice, I'm finding a place, I'm finding my tribe and a bunch of dead guys from, almost 100 years ago now or more. And it's like, it just feels comfortable. When Lewis talks about joy and like how it's more than pleasure, because pleasure is something that you can seek out and joy just kind of happens. Like there is something like there is a joy element when I sit down with these guys who were a part of the institution, but at the same time, it wasn't like they were necessarily, well, maybe in some ways with some of the other like more liberal German theologians, but they weren't necessarily like challenging the system, but they definitely weren't just, I'm going to regurgitate the system. You know, like they came at it in a very different way a lot of times. They were thinking outside of the box and in different ways. And yeah, maybe in certain light nowadays, some of their opinions on things doesn't make sense, or it is part of the institution now. But like there is something about like seeing men who were a part of the system and yet were coming at it from a very different way, very intellectual way, but also a very like creative way as well. Because let's not forget who we're talking about. You know, sure, I named off all those great German theologians, but like we're talking about at Oxford with the Inklings, guys who wrote poetry and fantasy epics and children's stories and sci-fi books and stage plays. Like they were coming at things very artistically. You know, the movie talks about like C.S. Lewis's love of G.K. Chesterton, who has this like, you know, very unique sense of humor and also a whole detective novel series. Like these guys are creative, they're brilliant, they come at things very differently while also still playing part of the system. These are all things that for me, I wish I could have. I wish I could have those things. You know, I'm trying to get more and more comfortable with being in a place where I am a lay person. I am a lay person. I do not see me being able to get into academia, or I do not think I am the right kind of a person to do pastoral ministry, at least not in the United States. So like those are the things that I wish I could have, but the reality is, as I often say, I'm just a guy from the Midwest. I'm just a guy from Hammond, and I don't see those kinds of things ever happening for me, but I wish it could. I wish I could. This was the pursuit this was the world that I was getting into. But enough about me. Let's get back into C.S. Lewis. I've been if you listen to this show and also my other show, Kung Fu Pizza Party, you know that I've been very like reflective recently on my life. And I think that's just kind of where I have been at lately. There's been a lot going on behind the scenes, a lot of just like personal stuff, family stuff, and it's just made me be very reflective, a lot of grief, some joy, some happiness along the way, but just a lot of like, you know, still that Michael W. Smith trying to find my place in this world. There he is. There's Brandon trying to take a serious moment and make a joke out of it. There he is. We're back. So like I said, go check this movie out. It's a lot of fun. One thing that they talk about in the in this movie, The Most Reluctant Convert, that I often forget about. I brought up the C.S. Lewis, the occultist part, which he says, and I forgot this does come up in Surprised by Joy, how if it wasn't for the fact that people who are in the occult at the time were very bad at recruiting, it's kind of the way he puts it, he probably would have ended up a Satanist at that point in his life, which would have been a fascinating, you know, darkest timeline kind of place that we live in. What would have that version of the Chronicles of Narnia looked like? But the other part that kind of comes up in this movie that I have forgotten about, you know, I love reading and studying how Lewis talks about joy. I have a sermon coming up that is going to be on what is joy kind of thing. And so I've been, you know, reading and studying Lewis's perspective on joy. And one thing that often gets left out of a lot of the snippets about what C.S. Lewis calls joy is that he does also call joy a kind of sorrow, a kind of grief, excuse me, not a sorrow, a kind of grief. Because again, it's this like this sensation, this experience that we have that then goes away. As soon as we have it, it's gone again. And we can try to spend our life trying to get it back, or we can go through life and cherish the moment when it does happen, knowing that it is going to pass. That this joy that we experience is a taste of heaven now. And I'm trying not to get too far ahead of myself, because that's what next week's episode is going to be. Look at this little thing I did here. We talked about faith and now this movie, and we're using this movie to pivot into an episode about Lewis and joy. Look at that. It's like I know what I'm doing sometimes. But it is interesting to think about joy as a form of grief, of like a happy grief, a holy grief. I don't know how to put it, and maybe by next week's episode I'll have more words to be able to describe this. But yeah, it's just interesting to think about like grief that in that kind of a way, because obviously, we've done C.S. Lewis on grief, we've done apologetics on grief kind of thing, problem of pain and suffering, all that kind of stuff. We don't ever think of grief like in a even remotely positive light. If it is, that it's kind of that like rushing through grief to get to the good part, not seeing grief in the moment as a good, enjoyable experience. It's fascinating. And I don't know exactly what that looks like in life, other than just when that moment of joy comes and it goes away. And just like it's a brief grief. A brief grief. That's what I'm to say. It's a brief grief of just this, of experiencing God in a very rich, very unique kind of way. But more on joy next week for sure, because I have a whole sermon to preach on it. So, but that's it for today's episode. A little bit of a shorter one, but honestly, this movie's kind of short, and I can only really talk so much about it. So thank you all for listening to today's episode. If you haven't yet already, please rate and review this show wherever you get your podcasts, and pass this episode along to a friend who you think would also enjoy this. Like I said, next week we will be continuing on this little C.S. Lewis train of episodes that we've been doing, and then after that episode, just as a friendly reminder, My Seminary Life is changing times. That's right. Fish Fridays is back in March, and we will be running through March and most of March and most of April on Fridays. So if you listen to this show and Kung Fu Pizza Party, you get a whole lot of me all in one day. Probably too much of me in one day. You should probably back off. The only person who should have to deal with that is my wife and my kid. So pace yourself. I'm exhausting. If you missed it, because it did happen this past week, the My Seminary Life YouTube channel got rebranded. Yes, the My Seminary Life YouTube channel is gone, and it is now Studio 219. Studio 219 is going to be the channel that hosts all of my video content. So really, as of right now, not much is changing outside of the name, the handle, the logo. Like all of that is changing, but everything else, the My Seminary Life and Kung Fu Pizza Party podcast episode, video episodes are going to be on there still. From the bookshelf, preaching residency vlog, seminary reflections, all of those are going to continue to be there. I've got a 6th show in development. I've got everything shot. I just got to put it all together. It's a little bit different. This project is a little bit different, so we'll see how it goes over. different by way of presentation, I will say. The platform is basically going to be a place for faith and pop culture. So if that is the kind of thing you like and you have not subscribed yet, you can find a link for it in the description of this episode. And I've said its name a couple times now, but if you haven't yet, please consider checking out my sister show, Kung Fu Pizza Party, also available here on the Anazao Ministries podcast network, your one-stop shop for all things faith and pop culture, because that's a lot of what we got going over here. Thanks again for listening. Until next time, this is Brandon signing off, reminding you as always that theology is for everyone, so keep on studying.